Hey everybody, Trent Lindsay here. I'm so happy to be back with you guys today on Facebook Live or YouTube if that's where you are watching me. Thank you for joining me today. I am excited to wrap up our discussion about blood sugar regulation and more specifically talk about the glycemic index and glycemic load of foods and how we need to kind of interpret that when we make our own decisions about what food we eat on a daily basis. I have some advice, so to speak, in regards to people who are diabetic or maybe trying to transition more into a plant-based lifestyle and eating more carbohydrates as a part of their diet, and how to kind of introduce those back into their diet if they've been following their doctor's most likely advice of high protein, high fat. So, in the first couple of videos, feel free to check those out on YouTube or on Facebook if you missed them, but we kind of started off the discussion about talking on how our blood sugar kind of gets regulated in our system. When you eat some foods that have carbohydrates, our body digests those carbohydrates and turns them into glucose and slowly releases those glucose into our bloodstream. And as our blood glucose levels increase, our insulin levels will increase as a result, trying to get the glucose to go into our cells. Now, if we are insulin resistant, meaning our insulin is not able to get the blood glucose into our cells, then what happens is we end up having a prolonged period of excessive amounts of glucose in the blood, as well as excessive amounts of insulin in the blood. The too much glucose leads to advanced glycation end products, which in the long term will increase your LDL cholesterol, which obviously is not good. And if you have too much insulin over the long term, then that basically signals the body to make and store fat. And that's pretty much what we talked about in the first discussion. Then in our second discussion, we talked about carbohydrates, protein, and fat, and how all three of them play a role in blood sugar regulation. One of the things I thought was so fascinating that I learned in my Mastering Raw Food Nutrition course is that the insulin in our blood will actually increase in response to a high protein diet, or any protein, not high protein, just having protein getting digested. That will also increase our insulin levels just as much, if not more, than the carbohydrates will. So if you have too much insulin, again, because you're having a high protein diet that your doctor recommended to you, then basically you have that same response of high insulin levels, which tells your body to make and store fat as well. So it's not just the high carbohydrate diets that'll do it to you, it's high protein diets. And then we also talked about fat and fat's role in regards to making our body insulin resistant in the first place. So if you want to reverse that and become more insulin sensitive, then you need to decrease the amount of fat in your diet, especially the saturated fat, which is the main culprit. So today, on to glycemic index and glycemic load. I think a lot of people are familiar with glycemic index. If you were to ask somebody, what foods had a high glycemic load, or a glycemic index, sorry, I think a lot of people would immediately jump to fruit. And it's definitely the case that some fruit does have a high glycemic index, and they immediately think that all fruit does, but in matter of fact, a lot of the foods, or a lot of the fruit, actually is on the lower end of the glycemic index. And when you factor in the amount of calories that you're getting from that and the amount of food that you're going to be digesting, it's actually relatively even lower on the glycemic load. So let's kind of talk about the difference between the two really quick. So in order to determine the glycemic index of foods, basically what they did is they've had different studies where they'll have a sample, a group of people, say 30 people, 50 people, whatever the case may be, right? And they feed them 100 grams of whatever the food is, so like bananas or dates or whatever the case may be. And what they do is they'll take blood sugar measurements for every 10 minutes or 15 minutes, for a couple hours in order to see what level of blood glucose there is in the blood, obviously. And they'll chart that out on a graph and then measure the area under the curve. And basically, in order to determine the exact glycemic index, they take an average of those 30 or 50 people. And one of the key things to keep in mind here is that everybody's different, right? The reason why it will take some people longer to have their glucose levels drop after eating fruit is because they're more insulin resistant. And somebody who is insulin sensitive and their body can convert that glucose and transfer it off into the cells relatively quickly, won't have as much glucose staying in their blood for a longer period of time. And this glycemic index score is basically just an average of everybody that was included in the sample. So it's not like it's an exact number. It really depends on the person. And so you take this glycemic index score, and it's all based off of the same number or amount of carbohydrates in grams that you're given. And then we're told, don't eat high glycemic index food. And two of the examples in the course that kind of stand out and is a good example to use is that watermelon and dates are both high on the glycemic index if you're given the 100 grams of each. And there's a big difference between watermelon and dates. For those of you that eat them often, the watermelon is very high water rich and definitely low calorie density, whereas dates don't have as much water. They can be dried, but sometimes they're just naturally drier, and have a high calorie density score. So it doesn't take very long to eat 100 calories worth of dates, but it will take a long time to eat 100 grams of dates, but it could take a long time to eat 100 grams of watermelon. And so that's how they determine glycemic index, right? And one of the things that most people forget about is the glycemic load, and that's where you start taking into account how much of the food you're actually eating. And basically it factors in the number of calories or the grams and carbohydrates that you're getting of a particular food. So in the example, if you ate 100 grams of dates and 100 grams of watermelon, then you're going to have that high glycemic index. But in reality, the amount of glycemic load that you're getting is very different between the two. You would still have a high glycemic load of 100, say if you ate just a whole stomach full of dates, right? You'd end up having not only a lot of the glycemic index aspect of it, but you'd also have a lot of calories to go along with it. You'd be eating a lot of grams of carbohydrates if you filled your whole stomach full of dates. So your glycemic load would be very high when eating that food. But if you were to fill your entire stomach full of watermelon, you aren't really eating that many grams of carbohydrates there because it's such a high water content rich food. And therefore the glycemic load is small because you aren't actually eating that much food when it comes to calories or grams of carbohydrates. And that's where the glycemic load is a much better measurement in terms of trying to figure out how a certain food item is going to affect your body. One of the things that's kind of interesting is that a lot of like bread products actually have a high glycemic load because you can they're very calorie dense, and you can end up eating a lot of grams of carbohydrates from the white bread products, such as just like white bread or bagels, and those actually have a high glycemic load and aren't that good for you. But a lot of people aren't afraid to eat those necessarily, like they would be afraid to eat other fruits. So that's the main difference between glycemic index and glycemic load. Based on my previous chats, obviously I'm recommending a high carbohydrate rich diet, and I'm not the only one that would recommend that for any of us out there, or diabetics in particular. There's actually this online summit, like a mastering, I don't know if it's mastering diabetes. There's a diabetes summit actually going on right now that I hope to be able to spend some time listening to a lot of these doctors speak in order to learn more about diabetes and their approaches or their recommended diets. But I know that they recommend a high, plant-based diet as well, so I'm really interested to see what their recommendations are for when people, transition over into it. But one thing that you could be a little bit more cautious on is you technically still have, if you are diabetic, you are insulin resistant, so eating 3 meals a day full of fruits, it may not be the best approach to just transition straight over into that. So you may want to try to incorporate more starches into your diet initially. So, maybe only have fruits at like one meal a day, and incorporate like a lot of steamed vegetables or raw vegetables into your diet. And those are still high in carbohydrates, but they're very much lower on the glycemic index relative to fruit. And then also include things like beans or rice and things like that in order to increase your calorie content, to make sure you're getting enough food along with the vegetables and high carbohydrate foods there as well. And then as over time, you're going to be able to check your blood glucose, and I think you'll start to understand when your insulin levels are or when you're becoming more insulin sensitive. And then at that point, you can start introducing more fruits into your diet as well. And I don't think it's going to take very long. It's actually quite inspiring. The Facebook group that I've joined with this diabetes summit, people have been switching over to a plant-based diet, and within a matter of just a couple of days, their glucose levels have been more stable and lower than they have been on any of the recommended diets their doctors have given them, which is just very, very inspiring to see that. I know I have a couple of people in mind that are diabetic, and I wish if they would see what some of these other people are going through, because I can't necessarily relate, right? I'm not diabetic, type 1 or type 2, right? So I can't necessarily relate directly to them, but when you see these Facebook groups that are designed to help support people with diabetes, I think it's fantastic, because you can see people who are in your shoes getting better based on these doctors' recommendations that are a little bit outside of the mainstream media, but they're based on scientific data, right? They're data-driven results. And I encourage any of you guys who are diabetic to go out there and reach out to those groups, become members, and really learn more about diabetes and how a plant-based diet can really fit into your lifestyle. So with that said, I'm just going to go and wrap up this discussion. Thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed this entire series of blood sugar regulation. And stay tuned. I believe the next topic that I'll be discussing is all about fat, or the essential fats that our body needs. I briefly discussed fats in a prior series, but I'm going to go a lot more detail and talk about the omega-6 versus omega-3 fats, which ones do we need, all, et cetera, et cetera. So stay tuned for that, and I look forward to seeing you guys next time. Have a great day.